Howdy, folks, and pull up a chair to the campfire here at Grit and Gunsmoke. Some stories are about heroes riding in under the bright sun to save the day. But the West, it had its share of darker tales. Stories of ghosts and grievances, of men who were erased and refused to stay gone. Before we journey into this particular darkness, do an old storyteller a kindness and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the fire that's coming. Now, listen close. This is the story of Ashfall, Kansas, and the man who came back from his own grave to burn it all down. The man who rode into Ashfall called himself Silas. He was a ghost wrapped in trail dust, his features obscured by a thick and trimmed beard and the deep shadow of a battered hat. He rode a nondescript roan, led a single pack mule, and his movements were quiet, economical, and went utterly unnoticed. In a town choking on its own fear, a quiet man who kept to himself was a blessing, not a curiosity. He was just another drifter, passing through. But he was not passing through. He was home. 10 years ago, this town had known him as Malcolm Carver, a decorated soldier from the war, a man who had traded his saber for a plowshare, a husband to a woman named Clara, and a father to a boy named Daniel. 10 years ago, his laughter could be heard in the general store, and his handshake was his bond. Now, all that remained of that man was a cold, hard knot of memory buried so deep it barely cast a shadow in his eyes. The town of Ashfall was a corpse of what he remembered. The hopeful energy of a growing community had been replaced by a sullen, hunch-shouldered fear. The Bleeding Spurs gang, once a pack of opportunistic vultures, now roosted on every corner. Their emblem, a spur dripping a single drop of blood, was branded onto the saloon doors, the livery, even the sheriff's office. They were not just outlaws, they were an occupation force. Malcolm Silas took a room at the back of the boarding house, one with a window that looked out over the muddy main street. He paid in cash and spoke only when necessary, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was a stranger even to himself. From this perch, he watched. He was a hunter in a blind, studying the patterns of his prey. He identified the key figures in the town's new, rotten hierarchy. There was Marcus Thorne, the gang's leader, the man who had once been a failed prospector and was now a king dressed in tailored suits, his power emanating from the railroad depot he controlled. There was Sheriff Miller, a man Malcolm had once called a friend, now a fat, sweating puppet with a tarnished star and eyes that never looked anyone in the face. And then there were the others, the foot soldiers. He saw their faces in the saloon, heard their loud, bragging laughter. And with each face, a memory would surface, sharp and searing as a hot brand. He saw Will Baxter, the man who had held the torch. He saw Frank and Jesse Miller, the sheriff's cousins, the men who had held him down. He saw them all, living and breathing and growing fat off the ashes of his life. The first night, the smell of coal smoke from the train depot drifted through his window. It was a smell that should have meant progress, industry. But for Malcolm, it was the smell of burning pine, of his own home collapsing in on itself. The memory was not a dream, it was a physical presence in the small room. The smoke, thick and black, choking the air. The heat, a living monster, blistering the skin. Clara's scream, a sound that had torn a hole in the world, cut short. Daniel, his small son, just 5 years old, reaching for him through the flames before the roof gave way. And he remembered being held down in the dirt outside by Frank and Jesse, forced to watch. He remembered Will Baxter, his face illuminated by the flames, a look of ecstatic cruelty in his eyes. He remembered Marcus Thorne, standing back in the shadows, calmly observing the destruction of a rival. They hadn't just burned his home. They had held a funeral pyre for his soul. They had beaten him, shot him, and left him for dead in the burning wreckage, branding him a traitor who had set the fire himself to escape his debts. But the fire had been his savior. It had cauterized his wounds, and the chaos had allowed him to crawl away, a broken, burned thing, into the night. The world had pronounced him dead. And for 10 years, in the brutal anonymity of the frontier, he had let them believe it. He had spent those 10 years being forged into something new. He had hunted bounties, worked as a scout for the army, and fought in conflicts that never made the newspapers. He had honed the deadly skills the war had taught him, sharpening them to a razor's edge. He had learned to live in the shadows, to be patient, to turn his all-consuming grief into a cold, focused instrument of will. He sat in his room, the sounds of the town a distant murmur. He had a list in his head, a ledger of debts to be paid in blood. He was not here for reconciliation. He was not here to reclaim his name. A name is a thing for the living, and Malcolm Carver had died in that fire with his family. He was here for the accounting. He went down to the saloon, the den where the vultures gathered. He sat in a dark corner, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey that tasted like ash, and he listened. He heard them toast to Thorne, to the new mining contract that would make them all richer. He watched Sheriff Miller share a drink with the very men he was supposed to be arresting. He saw the resigned, hopeless faces of the townspeople who served them, their spirits as broken as the floorboards. It was in the saloon that he first saw the girl. Her name was June. She was young, maybe 17, with watchful, intelligent eyes that held no fear, only a deep, simmering anger. She worked behind the bar, moving with a quiet efficiency, her expression a mask of contempt she barely bothered to conceal. He learned later that she was the daughter of Old Man Hemlock, a rancher who had refused to sell his land to Thorne and had disappeared a year ago. Malcolm saw a kindred spirit in her eyes, another soul living amongst the ashes of a stolen life. That night, he made his choice for the first target. It would not be one of the leaders. That would be too quick, too obvious. It would be a message. It would be Will Baxter. Baxter was now Thorne's personal bookkeeper, a man who had traded his torch for an ink pen, but whose hands were just as stained. Malcolm finished his whiskey, the liquid doing nothing to warm the permanent cold inside him. He stood up and walked out of the saloon, melting back into the shadows of the town. He was a ghost, and the haunting of Ashfall was about to begin. The silence of his return was over. Soon, the town would learn to scream. The decision to choose Will Baxter as the first was a cold and simple calculation. Marcus Thorne was the serpent's head, and the Miller brothers were its fangs, but Baxter was its venomous ink. He was the one who had legitimized their reign of terror, translating their brutality into the cold, clean language of ledgers and deeds. He had once shaken Malcolm's hand at church picnics. Now, he tallied the profits from the land stolen over the graves of his neighbors. Killing him first was not just an act of vengeance, it was a surgical strike designed to sow the purest form of terror, the kind that creeps in not through a hail of bullets, but through a quiet and locked door. For 3 days, Malcolm Carver, the ghost named Silas, did nothing but watch. He was a phantom in his own hometown, his presence a void that no one noticed. From the window of his boarding house, he mapped the small, predictable orbit of Will Baxter's life. The bookkeeper left his small, neat house at precisely 7 in the morning. He walked the 4 blocks to the railroad depot, where Thorne had given him an office. He took his lunch at the saloon, a single slice of pie and a glass of milk, a pathetic attempt to maintain an air of temperance amongst the wolves. He returned home at 5, locking his door behind him, believing his world was a fortress of numbers and routine. Malcolm's war began not with a gunshot, but with a whisper. On the first night, he waited until the town was draped in the deep, moonless dark of the prairie. He moved with a silence born of 100 wartime patrols. Baxter's lock was a cheap, simple thing, and it yielded to the tools of Malcolm's new trade in under a minute. He slipped inside the house. The air was stale, smelling of old paper and lonely meals. Malcolm didn't steal anything. He didn't break anything. He performed a series of small, deliberate violations. He opened the family Bible on Baxter's nightstand to a passage from Leviticus about retribution. He took the single, framed photograph of Baxter's long-dead wife and turned it to face the wall. He opened the window in the parlor just a crack, enough to let the cold night air and the mournful sound of the wind seep in. Then he left, locking the door behind him, leaving the sanctity of the man's home utterly compromised. The next morning, from his perch, Malcolm watched Baxter leave his house. There was a new tension in his shoulders, a slight, jerky hesitation in his movements. The ghost had knocked. The psychological warfare escalated. The second night, Malcolm entered again. This time, he left a single, perfectly formed bird's nest on the center of Baxter's meticulously made bedin, object of nature, wild and unsettling, in the heart of the man's sterile order. On the third day, Baxter was a nervous wreck. He jumped at every sound in his office, his eyes constantly darting towards the door. He skipped his lunch at the saloon. He hurried home, his hand on the small pistol he had started carrying in his coat. He was a man being haunted, and the beauty of it was that he had no one to tell. To admit his fears would be to admit his vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the Bleeding Spurs world. That evening, Malcolm set the final trap. He forged a note in Marcus Thorne's imperious handwriting, a simple, urgent summons, Baxter. An accounting error in the mining ledger. Meet me at the old church. Come alone. He had it delivered by a street urchin, a boy who would remember nothing but the coin he was given. The bait was perfect. Baxter's fear of the ghost was now overshadowed by his more immediate fear of his ruthless employer. The old Ashfall church stood on a hill at the edge of town, a skeletal silhouette against the starry sky. It had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered, its pews covered in dust and bird droppings. It was a place of dead faith, a fitting stage for a dead man's justice. Malcolm was already there, hidden in the shadows of the choir loft, a place where he had once stood with Clara singing hymns. The memory was a dull, cold ache. Baxter arrived, breathless and sweating, clutching a leather satchel. He crept into the nave, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. "Mr. Thorne," he called out, his voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. "He isn't coming," Malcolm's voice said, seeming to come from the very shadows themselves. Baxter spun around, his eyes wide with terror. He fumbled for his pistol. "Who's there? Show yourself." Malcolm stepped out from behind a crumbling pillar, a tall, dark figure in the gloom. He was not the drifter Silas now. His hat was off, and his face, though bearded, was clear in the faint starlight filtering through the broken windows. Recognition dawned in Baxter's eyes, followed by a wave of disbelief so profound it bordered on madness. He saw the ghost of a man he had helped murder 10 years ago. "Carver," he stammered, his pistol shaking in his hand. "No, you're dead. We saw you die." "You saw what you wanted to see," Malcolm said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was a stranger to them both. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. "You held a torch that night, Will. I remember the light in your eyes. You enjoyed it." "It was Thorne's orders," Baxter shrieked, his composure shattering. "He said you were a traitor. He said you were going to ruin us all." He finally raised his pistol, a desperate, panicked gesture. Malcolm didn't even flinch. Before Baxter could pull the trigger, a dark shape swung down from the rafters above. A thick rope, with a hangman's noose at the end, which Malcolm had tied off earlier, slammed into Baxter's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. Malcolm was on him in a flash, a specter of sudden, brutal violence. The fight was not a fight. It was an execution. Malcolm was stronger, faster, and fueled by a decade of cold, simmering rage. He subdued the whimpering, terrified bookkeeper with a grim efficiency. He did not give him a quick death. He dragged the man to the center of the nave, directly under the bell tower. He forced him to confess every detail about the fire, about Thorne's orders, about the names of the others. He was not just seeking vengeance, he was gathering intelligence. When he was done, he looked down at the pathetic, weeping man. "You balanced Thorne's books for him, Will," Malcolm said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Now, it's time to balance mine." He slipped the noose around Baxter's neck. He pulled the other end of the rope, hoisting the kicking, gasping man off the floor. But he didn't hang him from a beam. He dragged the rope up, into the bell tower, and tied it to the great iron bell itself. The next morning, the town of Ashfall woke to a sound they had not heard in years. The sound of the church bell, tolling a slow, mournful, steady rhythm. Dong, dong, dong. When Sheriff Miller and his cousins finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found Will Baxter's body, swinging gently in the bell tower, his kicking legs having been the instrument of his own funeral toll. In his mouth, they found a small, tightly packed ball of ash. The message was clear, silent, and terrifying. There was no evidence. There were no witnesses. A ghost had come to Ashfall, and it had just begun to collect its debts. The death of Will Baxter was a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of Ashfall. The ripples of fear spread quickly. Marcus Thorne was enraged, not at the loss of his bookkeeper, but at the audacious challenge to his authority. He put the Bleeding Spurs on high alert, their presence on the streets becoming heavier, more oppressive. They were looking for an enemy they couldn't see, a ghost who left no tracks, and their paranoia made them unpredictable and dangerous. The fear in town was now a palpable thing, a thick, choking dust that settled on everything. But for one person, the fear was mixed with a dawning, electrifying suspicion. June Hemlock moved through this new, tense world with a quiet, watchful grace. She worked long hours at the general store, a place that served as the town's unofficial heart, the crossroads of every rumor and whisper. She served the frightened townspeople, and she served the swaggering, nervous members of the Spurs. She said little, but she missed nothing. Her father had taught her to be an observer, to see the story that lay beneath the surface of things. She had noticed the stranger, the quiet man who called himself Silas. She noticed the way he sat in the saloon, not drinking to get drunk, but watching, his eyes missing no detail. She noticed that he had arrived just days before Baxter's impossible death. It was a coincidence, nothing more. But her father had also taught her that in a town like Ashfall, there were no coincidences. Her suspicion began to solidify into a theory during a heated argument at the store. Frank and Jesse Miller, the sheriff's brutish cousins, were questioning an old prospector, accusing him of knowing something about the ghost. "It's Carver's ghost, I tell you," the old man slurred, half-drunk and emboldened by fear. "He's come back for what's his." "Carver was a traitor who burned his own damn farm," Frank Miller snarled, shoving the old man. "And he's dead. I ought to know. I put a bullet in him myself." It was a small slip, a boast born of anger and whiskey. But it was a detail that contradicted the 10-year-old story the town had been fed. The official narrative, the one Sheriff Miller had endorsed, was that Malcolm Carver had died in the fire he had set. There was no mention of a bullet. June, stocking shelves nearby, froze. Her mind raced. Frank Miller had just admitted to shooting a man who was supposed to have died in a fire. The official story was a lie. That afternoon, driven by a gnawing curiosity, she walked to the old, abandoned church. The body was gone, but a grim, supernatural aura still clung to the place. She wasn't looking for clues to a murder, she was looking for confirmation of a ghost. She searched the dusty floor near where Baxter had been found, and she saw it. Tucked away near the base of a pillar, almost invisible in the gloom, was a small, tarnished brass button. It was an eagle, wings spread, the kind from a Union officer's uniform. She picked it up. Her heart began to pound. She remembered her father, a great admirer of Malcolm Carver, describing the man's famous uniform jacket, the one he had been so proud of, the one he was supposedly wearing the night of the fire. A ghost wouldn't lose a button. A man would. The impossible idea began to take root in her mind. The drifter, Silas. The lie about Carver's death. The button. Could the ghost of Ashfall be a man of flesh and blood? Could Malcolm Carver be alive? The idea was so audacious, so dangerous, that it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Her father had died defying the Spurs. She had been left with a legacy of quiet, simmering hatred. For the first time since his disappearance, she felt a flicker of something that was not despair. It was hope. A dangerous, terrible, and exhilarating hope. She decided to watch the stranger. She became a hunter in her own right, her quarry the ghost who haunted the town. She began to notice more things. The way Silas walked with a slight, almost imperceptible limp, the same one her father had said Carver had from a war wound. The way his eyes, when the light caught them just right, held a deep, stormy grayness that matched the descriptions of the town's fallen hero. She became obsessed. She was no longer just a barmaid, a shop girl. She was an investigator, the sole member of a conspiracy of one. She didn't know what she would do if her suspicions were true. Confront him. Help him. The questions were overwhelming. But one thing was certain. The story of Ashfall, the story of her own life, had just been ripped wide open. And she was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into a darkness that was finally beginning to have a name. With Will Baxter's death, the psychological balance in Ashfall had shifted. Fear was no longer a simple tool of oppression used by the Spurs, it was now a double-edged sword, cutting into their own ranks with paranoid precision. Malcolm Carver, from the quiet shadows of his new identity, watched the serpent begin to feed on its own tail. His next targets were the Fangs themselves, Frank and Jesse Miller, the sheriff's cousins, the two brutes who had pinned him to the earth and forced him to watch his world burn. He knew their nature. They were not strategists like Thorne or cowards like Baxter. They were wolves, but wolves who were only brave in a pack. Their strength was their shared, brutish confidence. Malcolm's strategy was simple. He would strip them of their pack, isolate them in the wilderness, and let the terror of the unseen do the work his bullets would later finish. The opportunity came a week after Baxter's death. June, now his unwitting informant, had overheard the Millers planning a trip. Thorne was sending them to collect a tax from a group of independent miners operating in the canyons north of town, a shakedown disguised as business. The route they would take was a new railroad spur, a line that ran over a small, rickety wooden trestle bridge spanning a deep arroyo. That night, Malcolm became a saboteur. He moved through the darkness with the skills of a wartime commando, his tools simple but effective: a pry bar, a hand drill, and a profound understanding of structural weaknesses. He didn't destroy the bridge, that would be too obvious. He compromised it. He drilled into the main support beams, weakening them from the inside. He used the pry bar to loosen the iron plates connecting the rails to the ties, just enough to create a fatal instability under a heavy load. He was not just setting a trap, he was turning the very symbol of Thorne's progress railroad into a weapon against him. The next morning, from a high hidden ridge, he watched. The Millers rode out, not on horseback, but on a small, steam-powered handcar fitted with a flatbed, carrying 2 other spurs with them. They were a small, arrogant army on their way to bully men poorer than themselves. As the handcar reached the center of the trestle bridge, Malcolm's work paid off. With a great, groaning screech of tortured metal and splintering wood, the weakened section of the bridge gave way. The handcar, the 4 men, and a section of track plunged into the arroyo below in a tangled wreck of steam and screams. It was a 40-foot drop, not enough to kill them outright, but enough to break bones and shatter their confidence. Malcolm watched as they crawled from the wreckage, dazed, wounded, and furious. Frank Miller had a broken arm, and one of the other thugs had a nasty gash on his head. They were alive, but they were now stranded, miles from town, in the heart of the canyons, in the Ghost's territory. For the rest of the day, Malcolm hunted them. He never showed himself. He became an unseen, malevolent force. He used the canyon's natural acoustics to his advantage, throwing rocks to create the sound of footsteps that weren't there. He used a piece of polished tin to flash sunlight from the high ridges, the glint of a sniper's scope that was never fired. He triggered a small rock slide that sent a cascade of pebbles down near their position, forcing them to scramble for cover, their nerves fraying with each passing hour. He was not just a man, he was the entire, hostile landscape. He was the whisper on the wind, the shadow that moved at the edge of their vision. The 2 extra thugs, simple men of violence, broke first. They argued with the Millers, their fear turning to insubordination. They decided to split up, to try their luck on their own. It was a fatal mistake. Malcolm picked them off, one by one, with single, silent shots from a rifle, leaving their bodies where they fell for the others to find. By nightfall, only Frank and Jesse Miller were left. They were wounded, terrified, and utterly alone, huddled together by a small, pathetic fire in the overwhelming darkness of the canyon. They knew they were being herded, toyed with by a hunter of supernatural skill. It was in this atmosphere of absolute terror that a new player entered the game. June Hemlock, driven by her terrifying, consuming suspicion, had done something reckless. After seeing the Miller brothers leave town, she had saddled her own horse and followed them, keeping a safe distance. She saw the bridge collapse. From her own hiding place, she witnessed the day-long campaign of psychological terror. She saw this quiet stranger, this Silas, move with the deadly grace of a panther, dismantling a group of 4 armed men with nothing but his wits and the wilderness. Everything she had suspected was true. The ghost was real, and he was magnificent and terrifying. As night fell, she knew she had to act. She tracked Malcolm to the small, hidden camp he had made on a high ridge overlooking the cowering Miller brothers. It was a cold camp, no fire, just a man and his rifle, patiently waiting. She approached the camp with her hands raised, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I'm not here to hurt you," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Malcolm materialized from the darkness, a rifle in his hands, his face a hard, unreadable mask. He had known she was there for the last hour. He had been tracking her as well. "You're a long way from the general store, girl," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Turn around and ride home. Forget what you've seen." "I can't," she said, her courage returning as she met his stormy, gray eyes. I know who you are." The words hung in the cold night air. "You're Malcolm Carver." His reaction was not what she expected. He didn't deny it. He didn't threaten her. A profound, weary sadness seemed to settle over him, the briefest crack in his iron facade. The ghost had just been seen. "That man is dead," he said, his voice flat. "He died in a fire 10 years ago." "You're mistaken. My father thought you were a hero," June pressed on, taking a step closer. "He told me stories. He never believed the lies they told. He was killed because he wouldn't sell his land to Thorne. The same man who destroyed your life destroyed mine. I want to help you." Malcolm stared at her, a fierce, internal battle playing out behind his eyes. For 10 years, he had been utterly alone, a solitary instrument of his own grief. This girl, with her father's fire in her eyes, was a complication he could not afford. She was a link to a world, to a humanity, that he had systematically burned out of himself. She was a weakness. "Helping me will get you killed," he said, his voice hard as stone. "They will see you with me, and they will put a bullet in you without a second thought. Go home. This is not your fight." He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal, and looked back down at the flickering fire of his prey in the canyon below. The haunting would continue. June stood there for a long moment, the cold of the night seeping into her bones. She was terrified, but she was not deterred. She looked at this broken, dangerous man, this ghost who was the only hope for her town, and she made a choice. She would not go home. She would not stay away. She turned and walked back to her horse, not to flee, but to begin her own, silent war in support of his. Malcolm Carver did not sleep that night. The girl's appearance had been a stone tossed into the deep, still, cold waters of his solitude. He had built a fortress around his grief, brick by painstaking brick, over 10 long years. He had convinced himself that Malcolm Carver was truly dead, that all that remained was that man, a creature of pure, dispassionate vengeance. June, with her defiant eyes and her talk of heroes, threatened to breach those walls. He finished his work in the canyon before dawn. He did not kill the Miller brothers. Not yet. He left them alive, stripped of their guns and boots, to make the long, agonizing walk back to Ashfall. He wanted them to carry his message of terror back to the heart of the serpent's nest. He wanted them to describe the ghost that had hunted them, to spread the seeds of paranoia and fear. When he returned to his own remote camp, a place he had believed to be utterly secret, he found a small burlap sack hanging from a tree branch. Inside was a loaf of bread, a piece of cheese, and a fresh canteen of water. There was no note. It was a silent, stubborn act of defiance. The girl had not gone home. Thus began the strangest and most fragile of alliances. June did not follow him again. She was too smart for that. Instead, she became his silent quartermaster, his invisible intelligence network. She understood that his greatest asset was his anonymity, his status as a ghost. She worked from within the town, a quiet saboteur in a calico dress. She created a dead drop in a hollowed-out log behind the abandoned church, a place of shared history. Every few days, Malcolm would find supplies waiting for him, ammunition she had managed to skim from the store's inventory, tins of food, and, most valuable of all, scraps of paper with information scrawled in charcoal. A shipment of rifles is due for the Spurs on the Wednesday train. Thorne is meeting with the banker, Abernathy, after hours. Sheriff Miller is drinking more than usual. His hands shake. Malcolm, in turn, began to rely on this invisible lifeline. He had been alone for so long, surviving on his own wits and strength. To trust someone, even in this small, detached way, was a foreign and unsettling feeling. He fought against it. He told himself she was merely a tool, a source of useful information. But he found himself looking for her notes, found a grim, unfamiliar warmth in the fact that someone, somewhere, knew he was alive and had not turned him in. The true test of their unspoken pact came a week later. Malcolm was planning his next move, a strike against the corrupt town banker, a man named Abernathy, who had been a close friend of his family before the fire. He needed to understand the man's routines, the layout of the bank. It was a risk he couldn't take himself. His face, though bearded, was still a danger. He left a note of his own in the hollow log, a simple and signed request, the bank. I need a map of the inside. The schedule of the night watchman. It was a test. A dangerous request that would require her to put herself at significant risk. For 2 days, there was nothing. Malcolm began to believe she had finally come to her senses, that the risk had been too great. He felt a pang of something he refused to name as disappointment. On the third night, the map was there. It was a crude but detailed drawing on the back of a piece of butcher paper, showing the teller windows, the manager's office, and, most importantly, the location of the large, main vault. A second note was with it. The watchman is Old Man Peters. He's half deaf and sleeps in a chair by the front door from midnight until dawn. Abernathy keeps a second, private ledger in a hidden safe behind the painting in his office. She had not only fulfilled his request, she had given him more than he had asked for. She had taken the risk. She had trusted him. That night, he decided to speak to her. Not as the ghost, not as a whisper in the dark. As a man. He found her as she was closing the general store, her face weary in the fading light. He simply appeared at the edge of the alleyway, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. She didn't startle. It was as if she had been expecting him. The map was good, he said, his voice a low rasp. I hope it's useful, she replied, her own voice quiet but steady. They stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the town a distant backdrop to the silent, momentous gravity of their meeting. Why are you doing this, June? He finally asked. The question raw and genuine. You could be hanged. They killed my father, she said simply, as if that were the only explanation needed in the world. They left my mother a shell of a woman. They are a sickness in this town, Mr. Carver. And you. You seem to be the only cure. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. My father used to say that some things are worth dying for. I think this is one of them. Malcolm looked at this young, fiercely determined girl, and for the first time in 10 years, the ice around his heart thawed, just a fraction. He saw not a liability, but an ally. He saw the same fire that had once burned in him, before it had been banked into a cold, hard coal of vengeance. He did not tell her his plan. He did not thank her, but he gave her something more significant. He gave her a piece of his own, buried truth. The night of the fire, he said, his voice barely a whisper, my son Daniel. He was wearing a small, silver cross, a gift from his mother. I was never able to find it in the ashes. He paused, the memory of physical pain. That is what they took from me. Not just a farm, not just a family. They took the small, simple things, the things that matter. It was the most he had spoken to anyone about his past in a decade. It was a confession, an acknowledgement, a fragile thread of trust, found in the darkness between two broken souls. He nodded once, a gesture of respect, of partnership. Be careful, June, he said. Then he turned and melted back into the shadows. He was still the Ash Man. He was still a ghost. But he was no longer completely alone. With a fragile but functional alliance forged with June, Malcolm's war for Ashfall entered a new, more insidious phase. He had terrorized the foot soldiers and established a legend. Now, it was time to attack the pillars of corruption that held up Marcus Thorne's rotten kingdom. His next target was a man who had committed a betrayal far deeper than any simple act of violence, Mr. Abernathy, the town banker. Abernathy had been more than a neighbor, he had been a friend. He had attended Malcolm and Clara's wedding, had held their son Daniel as a baby. Yet, the day after the fire, Abernathy, citing a small, insignificant debt, had foreclosed on the Carver farm with a speed that was vulture-like. He had then sold the prime land to a development company for a pittance, a company that was, of course, a front for Marcus Thorne. Abernathy had profited from the murder of his friends. For this, Malcolm decided, a simple bullet was too merciful. He would not destroy the man's body, he would annihilate his world, using the banker's own greed as the weapon. The plan was a masterstroke of psychological warfare and financial sabotage, made possible by the detailed information from June. She had provided not only the map of the bank but also the crucial detail about Abernathy's secret second ledger, one where he likely cooked the books and skimmed from his dealings with Thorne. Malcolm's first move was to create a phantom. He spent a night in the county records office in a neighboring town, using his skills to forge a series of impeccable documents, land deeds, transfer of sale notices, and banking receipts. The documents detailed a series of secret, highly profitable land deals Abernathy had supposedly conducted. cutting Marcus Thorne out of the loop and funneling a massive amount of money into a non-existent bank account in St. Louis. He was creating the perfect motive for Thorne to turn on his own man. His second move was the break-in. The bank was an easy target. As June's note had promised, the night watchman, Old Man Peters, was sound asleep in his chair. Malcolm slipped inside like a ghost. He went directly to Abernathy's office. The safe behind the painting was a simple, older model, and it yielded to his practiced, wartime skills with demolitions and delicate machinery. Inside, just as June had suspected, was the second ledger. Malcolm didn't steal it. He performed a delicate, surgical operation. Using a small, razor-sharp knife, he carefully altered several entries, subtly changing dates and figures to align perfectly with his forged documents. He then planted his forgeries amongst the other papers in the safe. He was not just framing Abernathy, he was creating a body of evidence so convincing, so detailed, that it would be an open and shut case in the kangaroo court of Marcus Thorne's paranoia. The final move was to light the fuse. He left an anonymous, crudely written note on the front desk of the railroad depot, addressed to Marcus Thorne himself. It said only, "Abernathy is a snake. Check the safe behind his desk. A friend." Malcolm retreated to the shadows to watch his handiwork unfold. The effect was even more immediate and brutal than he had anticipated. Thorne, already on edge from the attacks on his men, received the note the next morning. Consumed by the paranoia of a tyrant who trusts no one, he didn't delegate. He and 3 of his most brutal spurs, including the now humbled Frank Miller, stormed the bank in broad daylight. The town watched in stunned silence as Thorne's men dragged Abernathy from his office. The banker, his face ashen with terror and confusion, pleaded his innocence. Thorne, his face a mask of cold, betrayed fury, held up the forged documents. "You've been stealing from me, you fat pig," Thorne roared, his voice echoing across the main street. "Right under my nose." Abernathy's pleas for mercy were ignored. He had been a useful tool, but a suspected traitor was a liability that Thorne could not afford. The Spurs did not give him a trial. They did not take him to the sheriff's office. They dragged him to the center of town, to the very same spot where they had once boasted of their control. Malcolm watched from his window as his former friend was beaten, humiliated, and then, on Thorne's cold, final nod, shot in the head by Frank Miller. The banker's betrayal had come full circle. He had helped create a lawless system, and in the end, that same system had devoured him without a second thought. The public execution of the town's most respectable citizen was a profound shock. The town's elite, the merchants and officials who had made their own quiet, profitable deals with Thorne, were now terrified. They saw in Abernathy's fate their own potential future. They realized that their alliances with the devil offered no protection. The ghost of Ashfall had not just killed another man, he had shattered the illusion of safety that had held the town's corrupt hierarchy together. The serpent was not just being attacked from the outside, it was being tricked into eating itself. With the town's corrupt leadership in a state of terror and Thorne's paranoia at a fever pitch, Malcolm knew it was time to strike at the heart of the serpent, its source of wealth. The consolidated mine, which Thorne had acquired through the murder and intimidation of the original prospectors, was the engine of his entire operation. The silver pulled from its depths paid for his hired guns, bought his politicians, and funded his expansion. To truly break Thorne, Malcolm had to silence that engine. A direct assault was out of the question. The mine was heavily guarded, and more importantly, it was worked by dozens of desperate, debt-ridden miners who were little more than indentured servants. They were innocent pawns in Thorne's game, and Malcolm's war was not with them. His attack had to be surgical, a strike that would cripple the operation without harming a single worker. This was a mission that required the skills of Malcolm Carver, the commando, not the Ashman, the ghost. It required a deep understanding of engineering and demolitions, knowledge he had acquired in the crucible of the war, blowing up bridges and enemy fortifications. June, once again, was his indispensable key. The miners, seeing Abernathy's fate and sensing a shift in the winds of power, had become more willing to engage in small acts of secret defiance. June, through her network of quiet conversations and shared grievances, managed to acquire what Malcolm needed most, a detailed map of the mine's layout, hand-drawn by an old, trusted mining foreman. The map showed not just the main shafts, but the location of the critical machinery. His target was not the mine itself, but its heart, their crusher. It was a massive, steam-powered behemoth of iron and gears, a marvel of modern engineering that crushed tons of raw ore into manageable rock, the first and most vital step in the refining process. Without it, the mine was just a hole in the ground filled with useless stone. The attack was planned for a Saturday night, the one night of the week when the mine was shut down for maintenance, and only a skeleton crew of guards would be present. Malcolm moved under the cover of a brewing thunderstorm, the wind and distant rumbles of thunder masking his approach. He bypassed the main entrance, using the map to find a series of old, forgotten ventilation shafts on the far side of the mountain. He descended into the black, claustrophobic depths of the earth, here thick with the smell of damp rock and ozone. Navigating the labyrinth of tunnels was a tense, nerve-wracking process. He moved with a ghostly silence, his ears tuned to the drip of water and the distant footsteps of the patrol. He found the main crushing chamber, a vast cavern dominated by the silent, hulking form of their crusher. It was a temple of industry, and he was there to commit blasphemy. He worked with a cold, focused precision. His explosives were not crude sticks of dynamite. He used small, precisely measured charges of military-grade blasting powder, which he had acquired from a compromised railroad shipment weeks earlier. He didn't place them on the main body of the machine. He placed them at its most vulnerable points, the critical joints and support structures identified on the foreman's map, the main axle of the crushing wheel, the pistons of the steam engine, the gears of the main transmission. It was a delicate, surgical operation, designed to inflict maximum mechanical damage with minimal structural risk to the mine itself. He set the charges with a single, interconnected fuse, a long, slow-burning cord that would give him ample time to escape. As he was setting the final charge, he heard the crunch of boots on gravel. A two-man patrol, making their rounds earlier than scheduled, had entered the cavern. There was no time for stealth. The moment they saw him, their lanterns illuminating his dark figure, he acted. He didn't fire his gun. The sound would bring the entire garrison down on him. He threw a heavy miner's mallet, a tool left carelessly on the ground. It struck one guard in the chest, knocking the wind out of him. He closed the distance with the second man, a brutal, hand-to-hand fight in the flickering lantern light. It was over in seconds. He was a creature of wartime violence, and they were simple guards. He left them unconscious but alive, bound with their own belts. He lit the fuse. A small, sizzling spark began its slow journey. He made his escape back through the ventilation shafts, emerging into the raging thunderstorm just as the first, deep, muffled thump echoed from the heart of the mountain. It was followed by a series of smaller, grinding, and wrenching sounds, death screams of a great iron beast. The next morning, the full extent of the sabotage was revealed. Their crusher was a twisted, shattered wreck. Its main axle was cracked, its gears stripped, its engine ruined. The damage was catastrophic. It would take months and a fortune. Thorne didn't have to import a new one from back east. The mine was silent. The engine of Thorne's empire had been broken. The attack had a profound effect. It brought Thorne out into the open. He rode to the mine himself, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He saw that he was not just fighting a ghost who killed men, he was fighting a strategist, a saboteur who could strike at the very heart of his operations. He was no longer just paranoid, he was desperate. And a desperate Marcus Thorne, Malcolm knew, would be more dangerous and brutal than ever before. The ghost had crippled the machine. Now, the machine's master would unleash hell on the town of Ashfall. The silence of the crippled mine was a death knell that echoed throughout Ashfall. Marcus Thorne's primary source of wealth had been severed at the root, and the consequences were immediate and brutal. Thorne, now a cornered animal, responded not with strategy, but with blind, vicious rage. The thin veneer of his legitimacy crumbled away, revealing the tyrant beneath. He knew his local hired guns, the demoralized bleeding spurs, were no match for the phantom that was dismantling his empire. So he did what he had done before. He threw money at the problem. He sent riders out with purses heavy with gold and promises of more. Within a week, a new kind of evil descended upon Ashfall. They were not a gang with a name. They were a pack of jackals, a dozen of the territory's most ruthless guns for hire, drawn by the scent of blood and money. They were mercenaries with dead eyes and no allegiance to anything but the coin. With this new army at his back, Thorne's reign of terror intensified tenfold. A brutal curfew was imposed. Any citizen caught on the streets after sundown was subject to a beating or worse. Security checkpoints were set up on the main street, where Thorne's new muscle would shake down travelers and townspeople alike. Food and supply prices at the general store doubled overnight, a security tax to pay for the town's own occupation. Ashfall became an open-air prison, and the last vestiges of hope began to wither under the heel of Thorne's boot. Thorne was convinced the ghost had inside help. His paranoia, stoked by the banker Abernathy's betrayal, now fell upon the miners. He believed one of them must have provided the knowledge to cripple their crusher. He needed to make an example, a spectacle of cruelty so profound it would crush any thought of future resistance. His men dragged a mining foreman named Sullivan from his home. Sullivan was a good man, respected by the other workers, and known for his quiet defiance. He was the perfect scapegoat. They accused him of being in league with the ghost. Despite having no proof, a verdict was delivered by Thorne himself. They didn't just hang him. They made it a ceremony of terror. They built a gallows in the town square, a stark, new skeleton against the prairie sky. They forced the entire town to watch, the muzzles of the hired guns ensuring their attendance. Malcolm watched from a distant rooftop, his heart a cold, hard knot of fury in his chest. He was a ghost, a saboteur. He could not intervene directly without revealing himself and starting a bloodbath that would kill dozens of innocents. He was forced to watch as Thorne, standing on the gallows platform, delivered a venomous speech about traitors and the price of defiance. He was forced to watch as they put the rope around Sullivan's neck. He was forced to watch a good man die for a crime he did not commit. But Thorne had made a fatal miscalculation. The public execution was not the final straw that broke the town's spirit. It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. As Sullivan's body swung in the wind, a profound and terrifying change swept through the crowd. The fear did not vanish, but it was burned away by a wave of pure, collective rage. The sullen, beaten-down silence was replaced by a low, dangerous murmur. Men who had not looked each other in the eye for years now exchanged glances of shared, bitter hatred. Women who had taught their children to be silent now held them close, their faces masks of cold fury. The silent, individual acts of rebellion that June had cultivated now began to coalesce into a unified and spoken conspiracy. That night, the town fought back, not with guns, but with the thousand small cuts of a community united in purpose. The feed for the hired guns' horses was contaminated, sickening the animals. Tools went missing from the blacksmith shop. A fire, small but disruptive, broke out in the livery, forcing the mercenaries to spend the night fighting the blaze instead of terrorizing the town. June, her heart broken by Sullivan's death but her resolve hardened to steel, became the nerve center of this new resistance. She moved through the shadows, a conduit for the town's rage, translating their anger into coordinated action. Her network of whispers and secrets now had a single, unified purpose: to aid the Ashman in his final battle and to prepare the town for the coming storm. Malcolm, in his solitude, felt the shift. He saw the coordinated acts of sabotage. He received a note from June that was no longer just information, it was a battle plan. Thorne is bleeding money. The railroad is threatening to void his contract. He's planning a big show of force to impress a visiting railroad executive. A party at the train depot. In 2 days. All his key men will be there. The town is ready. Ash, just tell us when. The moment had come. Malcolm's personal, lonely war of vengeance was about to become a full-blown revolution. He had returned to Ashfall to bury his past in the ashes of his enemies. He now found himself the unlikely leader of a town that was finally ready to rise from its own. The night of the party at the train depot was thick with a tension that was almost electric. Marcus Thorne, in a final, desperate act of hubris, had spared no expense. Lanterns cast a festive, golden glow over the platform. A string quartet, brought in from Kansas City, played a tinny, inappropriate waltz. Thorne's hired guns, dressed in their finest, stood as grim sentinels, their hands never far from their pistols. This was not a celebration, it was a performance, a carefully staged illusion of power and control for the benefit of the visiting railroad executive, a man named Mr. Pembroke. Thorne believed this party, and the massive shipment of silver loaded onto the waiting train, would secure his future. He had no idea that he had gathered all his enemies and all his assets into a single, perfect kill box. He was hosting his own funeral. As the party-goers drank Thorne's champagne, the town of Ashfall prepared for war. This was Malcolm's masterpiece, a symphony of destruction conducted in perfect time. At precisely 9 o'clock, the first note was played. A massive fire erupted on the far side of town, a distraction created by a coordinated effort from the miners, who had set a pile of old mining timbers ablaze. A third of Thorne's hired guns, believing it to be the Ghost's main attack, mounted up and galloped toward the flames, abandoning their posts at the depot. At 9:15, the second note. As the fire raged, the townspeople, led by June, began their own quiet, terrifying advance. They were not an army with guns. They were an army of shadows, armed with lanterns, axes, and a decade of simmering rage. They formed a silent, closing perimeter around the entire train depot, trapping those inside. At 9:30, the Ghost took the stage. Malcolm had spent the previous night wiring the depot, not with a single, massive charge, but with a series of smaller, strategically placed dynamite bundles. He had mined the tracks 50 yards in either direction, the water tower, and the supports of the platform itself. He triggered the first charge. A deafening explosion ripped through the night as the tracks leading out of town were blown to smithereens. The train was trapped. Thorne's party descended into chaos. The music stopped. Men drew their guns, their eyes wide with panic. Then Malcolm's voice, amplified by a stolen station master's megaphone, boomed out of the darkness, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "Good evening, Marcus," the voice declared, a sound that was both human and spectral. "A lovely party. A shame it has to end." "Who's there?" Thorne screamed, his face pale in the lantern light, his own men scrambling for cover. "You know who I am," the voice boomed. "You called me a traitor. You murdered my family. You burned my home. My name is Malcolm Carver." The name hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The townspeople on the perimeter let out a collective gasp. The Ghost had a name. The legend was real. "I have 10 pounds of dynamite wired to this platform," Carver's voice continued, a cold, calm statement of fact. "And another 20 in the water tower above your heads. You have one chance to live. You will tell them everything. You will confess to the murder of my wife and son. You will confess to the theft of this town's soul. You will do it now." Trapped, surrounded, and with the disembodied voice of his own personal ghost holding his life in his hands, Thorne broke. At gunpoint from his own terrified men, who now saw him as the cause of their impending doom, he was forced onto a baggage cart. Trembling, his voice a pathetic, cracking whimper, he confessed. He confessed to everything. The fire, the murder of the Carvers, the conspiracy with Abernathy, the killing of Sullivan. The entire, sordid, bloody history of his reign came pouring out, a torrent of poison that washed away the last vestiges of his power. His confession was his own epitaph. The moment he finished speaking, his face a mask of sweat and humiliation, he made a final, desperate move. He had a loyal engineer in the locomotive. With a prearranged signal, a sharp whistle, the engineer suddenly threw the train into reverse, sending it lurching backward, away from the trap platform and toward the second, still intact section of track. Thorne made a break for it, leaping from the platform onto the slowly moving train, believing he could still escape with his silver and his life. But Malcolm was prepared for this. As Thorne scrambled onto the roof of a passenger car, a figure emerged from the smoke and shadows on top of the moving train. It was the etched man, a revolver in each hand. The final duel had begun. The hired guns on the platform opened fire, their bullets sparking off the metal of the train cars. The townspeople, seeing their chance, surged forward, their rage finally boiling over into open revolution. The depot became a war zone, and high above it all, on the swaying roof of the escaping train, silhouetted against the flames of the burning town, the ghost of Malcolm Carver and the devil named Marcus Thorne faced each other for the last time, their personal war reaching its thunderous, fiery climax. The roof of the moving train was a treacherous, swaying battlefield. Smoke and embers from the burning depot billowed around the two men, a fiery backdrop to the final act of a decade-long tragedy. Below them, the town of Ashfall was a chaotic symphony of righteous fury, sharp crack of gunfire, the splintering of wood, and the defiant roar of a community taking back its soul. But up on the train, there was only the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, the howl of the wind, and the cold, focused hatred between two men. Marcus Thorne, stripped of his power and prestige, was reduced to what he had always been at his core, a cornered, vicious animal. He fired wildly, his shots fueled by a desperate, panicked rage. Bullets tore through the thin metal of the roof around Malcolm, who moved with a calm, almost supernatural grace, the sway of the train as familiar to him as the deck of a ship to a sailor. Malcolm did not return fire immediately. He was a patient hunter, closing the distance, his gray eyes as cold and steady as the steel of the guns in his hands. This was not just a gunfight. It was a final, terrible communion. He wanted Thorne to see him, to recognize the face of the man whose life he had turned to ash, to understand the full scope of the reckoning he had brought down upon himself. They moved from car to car, a deadly ballet silhouetted against the flames. As the train gathered speed, pulling away from the sounds of the town's liberation and into the vast, dark emptiness of the prairie, the world shrank to just the two of them. The end came on the flat car that held Thorne's silver, the very prize for which he had sacrificed his soul. Thorne, his pistol empty, threw the useless weapon and lunged, his face a mask of primal fury. He tackled Malcolm, and the two men crashed down among the heavy, wooden crates of bullion. It became a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. Thorne had the weight of a man softened by wealth, but Malcolm had the weary, unbreakable strength of a man who had survived on nothing but hate and willpower. They rolled across the flat car, the wind tearing at them, the abyss of the speeding landscape a blur on either side. In the end, it was not strength that won. It was purpose. As Thorne fumbled for a loose iron pry bar, his eyes wild with the intent to kill, Malcolm saw not the face of his enemy, but the ghostly, superimposed images of his wife and son. He saw Clara's smile and Daniel's laughing eyes, and a strength he didn't know he possessed surged through him. He slammed Thorne's head against a wooden crate, dazing him for a split second. It was all the time he needed. He retrieved one of his fallen revolvers. He pressed the cold muzzle against Thorne's chest, right over his black heart. "This is for Clara," he rasped, his voice raw with a decade of tears. Bang! "This is for Daniel." Bang! "And this is for the man you forced me to become." Bang! The final shots were swallowed by the roar of the train and the wind. Marcus Thorne, the tyrant of Ashfall, lay dead amongst his useless fortune. The train, a fiery serpent carrying the corpse of the town's devil, continued its thunderous journey into the night. Malcolm, wounded and bleeding from a gash on his side, knew he could not stay. He pushed Thorne's body from the train, an offering to the prairie wolves. He then worked his way to the last car and, as the train slowed to cross a wide, deep river, he leaped, plunging into the cold, dark water below. The ghost vanished, washed clean by the current. The next morning, a new and unfamiliar sun rose over the town of Ashfall. The fires were out. The silence was not one of fear, but of exhausted, fragile peace. A detachment of U.S. Marshals, summoned by a telegraph from the panicked railroad executive, rode into town. They did not find a town in chaos. They found a community that was already beginning to rebuild. They found dozens of witnesses, their voices finally free, all telling the same story. They found the body of Sheriff Miller, hanged by the townspeople from his own gallows. They found a full, signed confession from Thorne, which June had retrieved from the depot office where Malcolm had forced him to write it. The power of the bleeding spurs was not just broken, it was erased. But of the man who had made it all possible, there was no sign. Malcolm Carver did not stay to see the new dawn he had created. He secretly made his way to the small, overgrown cemetery on the hill, his wounds bound with strips of his own shirt. He stood before the two simple and marked graves where he knew Clara and Daniel lay. He did not speak. He did not pray. The time for words and prayers was long past. From the inside of his coat, he took two small objects. The first was a tattered, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the dark, looping scrawl of his 10 years in the wilderness, a record of his pain and his purpose. The second was a small, silver cross, blackened and half-melted, the one he had finally found clutched in Thorne's dead hand, stolen from his son as a trophy all those years ago. He laid them both gently on the charred earth where his home had once stood, a final, silent offering to the ghosts of his past. He met June one last time, a fleeting, silent encounter at the edge of town just before sunrise. No words were needed. He saw in her eyes the future of Ashfall, a future of strength, courage, and a justice that would never again be taken for granted. He saw his own legacy, not of death, but of rebirth. She saw in his the profound, unbreakable sorrow of a man who could never come home, because his home was a place that existed only in memory. He gave her a single, solemn note of farewell, a thank you, a passing of the torch. Then, Malcolm Ash Carver, the man they called Silas, the ghost who had returned, mounted his horse and rode away. He melted into the vast, indifferent landscape of the prairie, a solitary figure disappearing into the horizon. He did not seek forgiveness or a new life. He sought only the silence that had been his companion for a decade. He left the town of Ashfall to heal, and in his wake, he left a legend. A story that would be whispered around campfires for generations to come. The story of the Ashnan, the ghost who had crawled out of his own grave, not to reclaim his life, but to prove a terrible and profound truth of the West. Justice doesn't always rise with the sun, sometimes it crawls from the ashes.